information. Red flag warning remains in effect until 7 p.m. this evening for wind and low relative humidity. A red flag warning means that critical fire weather conditions are either occurring now or will shortly. Any fires that ignite may spread rapidly and exhibit extreme fire behavior. Use extreme caution if engaging in any activities that could start a fire. A red flag warning means that critical fire weather conditions are either occurring now or will shortly.
The other day, and I said, "What are you doing?" Because he goes, "I'm in the center of the house, and I heard the tornado sirens going on during that time." But I meet with a group of guys on Saturday mornings just for a little bit of prayer and Bible study, accountability type thing. And over the last couple of weeks, we've got to the prayer thing. I have prayed for one specific item: reprieve. Have you ever done that? Felt like you just feel like life is just bombarding you? A couple weeks ago, our daughter was married. Her wedding was on June 10th, and I had kind of hoped that like the 11th or 12th, things would I would be able to exhale. That's yet to have happened. And in fact, I'll even say it feels like the wheels are coming off sometimes. But with that, there's one thing that's been kind of cool over the last couple of weeks, specifically this week. My son, our oldest son, Zach, is a student pastor in Dodge City, Kansas, and he's actually preaching in Big Church this morning. And so he sent me his sermon and had me kind of work through it with him and different things like that. That's kind of a cool thing. But as we were doing so, came across a statement. And I was like, I don't quite get this statement, so can you help me with this? And after he explained it, I thought, that's pretty brilliant. That's actually pretty good. The statement is, don't hear what I'm not saying. And so the reason why I asked him to explain it is, I was like, that kind of sounds a little weird. He says, Dad, I'm a student guy, and I preach to students all the time. And so sometimes when I need to be really, really clear, I will kind of introduce it with, don't hear what I'm not saying. Because a lot of times people want to hear what they want to hear, not actually what they are hearing. And so as I was kind of putting together my introduction for my sermon, believe it or not, that's the last thing I usually do when I write a sermon. I was thinking, what do I do? And I thought, I'm going to use that. I want to say a statement, but before I say that statement, I'm going to say this: don't hear what I'm not saying. You see, we have a pride problem. Now, a lot of you automatically, being that this is June, and June is Pride Month, are going there. Now, I think there's time for us to talk about that. And we have to realize that what is happening during Pride Month is an expression of human pride. But I'm going to say we have a pride problem. And when I say we have a pride problem, I'm talking about folks in the room. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about every single one of us in this room. We have a pride problem. And one of the things that we have to understand is that pride is sinful. In fact, in the list of the 7 deadly sins, right? Pride comes first. So pride is a sin. That moment that we become self-absorbed and we make life all about ourselves. And so when we think about pride, one of the things we have to understand, as a sin, God gives us warnings in Scripture against that very sin. And when we drift toward pride, and we drift toward arrogance and self-absorption and self-righteousness, one of the things that we have to understand is God oftentimes puts warnings in our path, not so that we will continue in pride, but ultimately that we will humble ourselves before Jesus, and that we'll allow Him to direct the course and path of our lives. So with that, we're going to look at a story from the Old Testament. We're going to kind of close out our red flag warnings story, our series. And with this, we're going to look at a story from the book of Numbers, chapter 16, that quite honestly, I've never heard a sermon on this. Never heard a sermon on this because this is one of those I didn't know it was in the Bible sort of stories. But it's in the Bible. And I think it's valuable in our walk and our journey with Jesus. And really, it is a story about what one man's pride did to a few people, and it spread throughout the camp. It's a story of Korah. In fact, and if you look at your Bibles, probably the heading will ultimately say Korah's rebellion. We're going to look at that. Let's look starting with verse 1. One day, Korah, son of Ishar, a descendant of Kohath, son of Levi, conspired with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, from the tribe of Reuben. They incited a rebellion against Moses along with 250 other leaders of the community, all prominent members of the assembly. They united against Moses and Aaron and said, "You've gone too far. The whole community of Israel has been set apart by the Lord, and He is with all of us. What right do you have to act as though you are greater than the rest of the Lord's people?" So really kind of what's going on, Moses and Aaron, they are basically the ones who get to go into the literal presence of God. They get to go in and converse with God. You know, the glorious appearing of God would come down in the form of a cloud. And they were the two that got to do that. And Korah, it kind of incites a rebellion along with the fact of, why are you so good? Why are you so special that you get to do that? Shouldn't all of us get to do that? And so he was operating with self-righteousness. He was operating with pride. He had discontent for the fact that Moses got to do stuff and he didn't get to. And it was just really kind of like, it was the beginnings of a prideful rebellion that was happening throughout all of Israel, throughout the entire camp. In fact, what we find, though, is how Moses reacted is important. And it's important that we understand that he reacted in a way that was not prideful. Notice verse 4. It says, when Moses heard what they were saying, he fell face down on the ground. In other words, he responded to this person's pride by not matching pride with pride, not trying to argue through this, not trying to confront the issue. Rather, he fell down on his face before God. He turned to God instead of trying to do this himself. But in verse 5 it says, then he said to Korah and his followers, tomorrow morning the Lord will show us who belongs to him and who is holy. The Lord will allow only those whom he selects to enter his own presence. So he says, listen, we're going to let God decide. But he continues to kind of engage Korah. And in verse 8, he says something very important. Verses 8 through 10. Then Moses spoke again to Korah. Now listen, you Levites. Now when he says, listen, you Levites, we understand that there were multiple tribes in the nation of Israel. There were actually 12, but there was like this 13th tribe, and they were the Levites. Levites didn't necessarily get a land. Rather, they were dispersed throughout the nation, and they assisted in the worship of Israel. Some of the Levites became priests, but not all of the Levites were able to become priests. And so what we find is Korah was among those who were not a priest. Does it seem insignificant to you that the God of Israel has chosen you from among the community of Israel to be near him, so you can serve in the Lord's tabernacle and stand before the people to minister to them? Korah, it mentions him specifically. He has already given you this special ministry to you. and your fellow Levites, are you now demanding the priesthood as well? So Korah is consumed by pride. And as he is consumed by pride, here's something that happens. He is unable to see the blessings that God has already given him. He's unable to see the good that is in his life as a result of the blessing of God. And I have to think that we can be like that in our own lives, that we get consumed with pride and we fail to see the good that God has brought into our lives. And for me, that's a red flag warning. That's something that I need to kind of check myself here. But notice verse 11. The Lord is the one you and your followers are really revolting against. For who is Aaron that you are complaining about him? And so this was gut check for me. And it's something that I realized in my own life, that complaining fueled by pride is a form of rebellion against the sovereignty of God. That when I start complaining and saying, well, I don't like this situation in my life, or I don't like this that is going on in our world, we begin to complain. Whether we know it or not, this is not that we're complaining against whatever is going on. We are ultimately revolting against God. That's a big thing. And I know that for me, as I look at my life, I can drift into complaining so easily. I would even say that an official pastime of my life is complaining. It's so easy to go there. It's so easy to be there. But this is something that I think we have to grapple with. But then again, we understand that this was not just, he mentioned that there was Korah and Dathan and Abiram, but there was also the 250 who began to complain. And this is what they were complaining about. Isn't it enough that you brought us out of Egypt, a land flowing with milk and honey, to kill us here in the wilderness, that you now treat us like your subjects? Again, they're complaining against Moses and Aaron, but it's really ultimately against God. And they had this rose-colored glasses about Egypt and a land flowing with milk and honey. They were in slavery there. They've forgotten that part. What's more, you haven't brought us into another land flowing with milk and honey. You haven't given us a new homeland with fields and vineyards. Are you trying to fool these men? We will not come. And again, they're complaining that we have a point A was Egypt, the point B was the promised land, but they're complaining that it's taking too long. That God is kind of taking the scenic route to get them there, and we understand because of their grumbling, because of their rebellion, it's going to take them 40 years. But I think there's something important that we have to understand here about what God is oftentimes doing in our lives. I was actually talking with a friend a month or two ago, and he looked at me and he said, so, God's got a long game. And it was kind of in the form of a question. God's got a long game. In other words, the path that God has us on in our life is seldom straight and seldom short. But in that path that God has us on, He is really doing some work in our lives. And it's not up to us to complain about it, rather yield to God in what He's doing in that seldom short and seldom straight path that He has us on. But we get to verse 16, kind of the end of day one. Moses finally closes it out with this. Moses said to Korah, you and all your followers must come here tomorrow, present yourselves before the Lord, and Aaron will also be here. This is kind of like the Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Like God is going to settle this. God's going to be the determining factor here. So Moses invited them to come back in the morning, invited the 250 people who were complaining, bringing with them incense. And incense was used in the worship in the tabernacle. But we also read that kind of like the very next day, here's what's kind of happening. Verse 19, meanwhile, Korah had stirred up the entire community against Moses and Aaron, and they all gathered at the tabernacle entrance. The glorious presence of the Lord appeared to the whole community. Now, when the glorious presence of the Lord was appearing and so on, Here's what God is about to do. It started with Korah, it went to Dathan and Abiram, and then it went to the 250. And by morning, the entire community of Israel is complaining against God. They're rebelling against God, and God says, that's it. Now, when God says, that's it, that's never good. And he's like, I'm going to destroy, I'm destroying the whole lot of them. He's going to wipe them all out. Moses and Aaron, they fall face down, and they're pleading with God, not for the people, but for his glory. It's like, listen, this is about you, and this is about your name. You said you're going to bring them into the promised land. So he's like, listen, don't destroy all of them as a result of one man's sin. And so God instructs Moses and Aaron, here's what I need you to do. I need you to tell people to get away from Dathan and Abiram and Korah. And basically, this is what is happening. Moses basically says, listen, God's either going to let these guys die a natural death, which will affirm that they are right, or he's going to do something new. And in verse 31 of chapter 16, God does something new. He had hardly finished speaking the words when the ground suddenly split open beneath them. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed the men, along with their households and all their followers who were standing with them, and everything they owned. So they went down alive into the grave, along with all their belongings. The earth closed over them, and they all vanished from among the people of Israel. It's heavy stuff. It kind of lets me know that God does not deal lightly with the issue of human pride. It's not like he's like, hey, it's okay. Human pride and rebellion against God is a serious thing. But this isn't the end of the story. This was just the three that started the rebellion, and ultimately Korah, who started the rebellion. There was also the other 250. So in verse 35, we see what God does as they begin to make their journey toward the entrance of their tabernacle. So they wanted to go into the literal physical presence of God. And then it says this, then fire blazed forth from the Lord and burned up the 250 men who were offering incense. When it means it burned up, he incinerated them. There was nothing left. So this is serious stuff. And again, this doesn't get preached very often. So let's just kind of recap. Day one, Korah leads a rebellion against God. Day two, God settles the matter. And he does it in rather dramatic fashion. Now, if I'm one of the citizens of Israel, and day one is rebellion, day two, God shows up in a big way, the glorious appearance of the Lord, fire from heaven, earth swallowing up people, I think I'm going home, and before I pray, or before I go to bed, I'm on my knees praying, and I'm saying, God, you know what? I'm sinful, you're good, you're awesome. It's not about me. I think let's just leave it at that, right? You would think that that is what the people of Israel did. Yeah, that's not what happened. In fact, day three is kind of like day one all over again. Notice verse 41. But the very next morning, the whole community of Israel began muttering against Moses and Aaron, saying, you have killed the Lord's people. I'm going to say these folks are really slow learners. And in verse 42, as the community gathered to protest against Moses and Aaron, they turned toward the tabernacle and saw the cloud that had covered it, and the glorious presence of the Lord appeared. Now, yesterday, the glorious presence of the Lord appeared. It didn't end well. And Moses and Aaron came and stood in front of the tabernacle, and the Lord said to Moses, get away from all these people so that I can instantly destroy them. But Moses and Aaron fell face down on the ground. Again, they are pleading with God not to destroy all the people. Why? Is it because they love the people, or they want the name of God to be glorified? It's ultimately, this is on God. They want Him to be glorified. They don't want anything that would come apart, that people could discredit His name. And so God, He still goes, and He is releasing a plague. And Moses and Aaron, they went and got the incense from the tabernacle, and incense was, from a spiritual sense, a purifier. And they took that throughout the entire camp of Israel. And what we read in verse 48 is, He stood between the dead and the living, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people died in the plague, in addition to those who had died in the affair involving Korah. Listen, there's a reason why this chapter in the Bible doesn't make it into a lot of sermons. This is like fire and brimstone sort of God. This is the sermons that what you've heard me refer to them, Papa Vein preachers. This is the chapters that they preach. You know, they get so angry that the veins in their neck just kind of pop out. This is the all-consuming fire sort of God. And we don't like to talk about this. We want good Father God. But listen, God is serious about the issue of human pride. And when I think about God is serious about the issue of human pride, I think one of the reasons why we need to be reading and preaching from passages like this is, I think about my own church experience. Grew up in Southwest Kansas. Growing up in Southwest Kansas, we had a little church. I attended that church all my life, every Sunday, from the time I was born till the time I graduated high school. We actually walked to church because we only lived a block and a half away. But there was a group of people, and I think they came into prominence and leadership in the 60s and 70s. But there was a group of people that made it their purpose in the church to irritate the minister. Really. As soon as the new minister would come into the church, they made it their purpose to become like the official grumblers and complainers against everything that those preachers did. Now, while it took a long time, I'll tell you that church is no longer in existence. Back in the mid-90s, I was in Abilene, Texas, and I went to play a golf tournament in one of those golf scrambles. And if you're in a golf scramble, that is one of those tournaments, and they make you the D golfer, that means you're really bad. And so I was the D golfer. And if you've ever golfed with me, you'll say, yeah, Brandon, you're like E or F or G. You're really, really, really bad. But anyway, I was with a guy, and he was driving the golf cart, and he said, hey, do you mind if I go get something out of my truck before we head to our hole? And that was a fifth of whiskey, which he downed during that time of, that we were on the golf course. But proverbially, when guys get together, it's like, what do you do, and what do you do? And I told him that I was a minister at a little church, and he was like, what church is it? And I explained what church it was. And even though he wasn't churched, this is what he said. That's the church that fights and splits all the time. And, I think about that church is no longer in existence. But I also think about this. Almost every church I know of has had some kind of skirmish, a little bit of grumbling and complaining that goes on. I'll tell you something that happened several years ago. In fact, it was probably about 12 years ago that we had a situation here at Valley View, and that's long gone and so on. But you know the car show that's down at Walmart, Father's Day car show, started here. We had it here for 9 years. And if you can imagine what went on down there, we would have that on our property every Father's Day. It was nuts. We'd go through like 6,000 cans of pop, a couple thousand hot dogs. I mean, it was just inundated with people. But for various reasons, part of it got to be too big. For various reasons, we decided God was taking our ministry in another direction. Ultimately, the direction we felt God was taking our ministry is to do things like Love Week as opposed to just like fun activities that happen on our property. And we made the announcement that we were going to have the car show anymore. Let's just say it wasn't a popular decision. And there was one particular Bible study, and it was a men's Bible study, and it started to get really contentious. It started to get really bad to where there was a group rising up from within that they felt like they were going to take it to the rest of the church to correct the decision that the leaders made. But there was one man, some of you know him, his name is Paul. Paul is one of those guys that when he speaks, he's kind of like E.F. Hutton, you lean in, you listen. But when Paul spoke up, he said, listen, in the Old Testament, there's a story of a man leading a rebellion against the leaders that God had appointed, and it didn't end well for them. And so he said, as a cautionary tale, if you lead a rebellion against the leadership of this church, I don't know what's going to happen in this life, but I know God will not look kindly upon that. And the little skirmish stopped. And I'm so thankful for that man who was willing to speak up. But I want to tell you something. I look at, stories like this, and it's real easy for me to say, well, I've never caused a church split. I've never caused a division. I've never even caused a tiny little skirmish within the body. And you probably say that. But let me ask you this question. Have you ever complained? Have you ever complained? Have you ever looked at a situation in your life and told God, not in so many words, that whatever He's doing, He's not doing a very good job at being God? Have you ever looked at what somebody else is getting to do, maybe at work, and you think, I should be doing that? Somebody else gets the promotion. Somebody else gets the notoriety or the compliment, and you're thinking, what is wrong with me? Have you ever been there? And for me, that's where this is where it becomes a red flag warning, because it is so easy for us to get into the role of complaining. And so when we think about that, when we think about grumbling, we think about complaining, we think about pride and arrogance and self-absorption, whatever it is sinful. And here are a few red flag warnings. Discontentment breeds ingratitude. When I'm discontent with where God has put me, I can't see the good things in my life, and therefore cannot be thankful for what God is doing and what God is blessing my life with. Also, grumbling and complaining are forms of rebellion against the rule and reign of God. I was telling a person earlier this week that very few precious things in our lives come to us without pressure and fire. That sometimes we have to go through the fire to get to that good place that God desires for us to be. And when we complain about what is happening in our lives, we fail to see that God might actually be refining us. He might actually, and I use this term with all seriousness, He may be sanctifying us. That He is using the things of our lives to help us to become more like Jesus. And we fail to see that. And so that is a form of rebellion against what God is doing. Also, pride leads to spiritual blindness. When I'm self-absorbed, when I am arrogant, when it's all about me and I think that I am awesome, I fail to see the areas of my life where I am sinful and broken. And so, listen, but I think the good thing here is this doesn't have to be the end of the story. Because it's real easy to look at these passages like Korah here and become discouraged. And so red flag warnings are really not meant to discourage us. Actually, red flag warnings, and this is our bottom line, they are meant to humble us before God. They're meant to bring us to a place where we heed the warning and make the adjustments in our lives so that we can walk better with Jesus. That's what God desires. So I grew up in southwest Kansas. And I will tell you that one of my favorite things to do was to sit on a tractor with my grandpa. My grandpa, we had this little quarter section, which isn't a whole lot. It's not going to make you any money. It's kind of like a hobby farm. But I loved going out and sitting on the tractor with my grandpa. We had a 40-20 John Deere tractor, and it had that unair conditioned cab and so on. I loved it because we could see forever. I could see elevators in grain elevators in 3 different towns from where our farm was. So I'd go out and sit on the tractor with my grandpa. And there was always certain things that I could expect would happen when I would be on the tractor with my grandpa. Lunch stayed in the truck. But my grandpa always had a big jug of water, a thermos of coffee, a new pack of Kools. Y'all remember Kool cigarettes? And an old radio. This was pre-boombox sort of radio. And we always listened to KGNO out of Dodge City, Kansas. 1370 KGNO out of Dodge City. Old country music. I'm talking old country music. That was the one part that was not glamorous or good. There were always crop reports. If you listen to radio in Kansas, you can expect weather reports, crop reports, and Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey had and now the rest of the story. One of the things I love about Korah's rebellion is it doesn't end in rebellion. That there's truly an end of the story. In fact, in Numbers 26, so it's kind of wrapping up the book of Numbers. Numbers 26, verses 10 through 11, it says, "But the earth opened up its mouth and swallowed them with Korah, and fire devoured 250 of their followers." Notice what it says next. "This served as a warning to the entire nation of Israel." But then verse 11, "However, the sons of Korah did not die that day." The sons of Korah did not die that day. Did you catch that verse? Did you catch that? Usually the whole family was annihilated, but for some reason the sons did not die that day. Now, it could have been they were too young and God spared them. It could have been that they were old enough and wise enough to know better and they did not join in. But for whatever reason, the sons of Korah did not die. And thank God that we have the book of 1 Chronicles. I don't know that I've ever uttered those words in my life. 1 and 2 Chronicles are tough reads, right? A lot of such and such begat such and such in there. But we also find a little bit about the sons of Korah. And in chapter 6, we read about a man who comes onto the scene. His name is Samuel. And Samuel was a prophet of God. And Samuel came, and it talks about his family line. And Samuel was the one who got to be the one who anointed David as king over Israel. But when it tells us about his family tree, he came from the line of Korah. And so I get to say, God's not done. I mean, this was a big sin, but God wasn't done. And then I think about chapter 9, and chapter 9, verse 19. This isn't up on the screen because I forgot. But it says, Shallum was the son of Korah, a descendant of, I cannot say this name, from the clan of Korah. He and his relatives, the Korahites, were responsible for guarding the entrance to the sanctuary, just as their ancestors had guarded the tabernacle and the tent of the Lord. Do you see, for generation after generation after generation, Korah, and then his sons and subsequent sons. Their job was to be the gatekeeper of the temple, the gatekeeper of the tabernacle. They got to control who came in and who didn't make the cut. This was a big thing. That's what Moses was saying. This is no small thing. And then chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 6, is talking about David's men going into battle. Elkanah, Ishiah, Azarel, Jozer, Jashobeam, who were Korahites. Some of David's mighty warriors, sons of Korah. I also think, I look at this, there are Bible names that stuck around and Bible names that didn't. Jozer, kind of wish that one would have stuck around. Anybody with me? Anybody expecting right now? $100 if you name your son Jozer. And still God's not done. Have you ever read the Psalms? Usually it's a Psalm of David, a Psalm of David, a Psalm of David, but there are 11 Psalms that are sons of Korah. One of those Psalms, Psalm 46. Psalm 46, verse 10, we quote all the time, "Be still and know that I am God." Well, that idea of be still is to drop your defenses before God. Also, Psalm 84. "A single day in your courts is better than 1,000 anywhere else. I would rather be," catch this, "a gatekeeper in the house of my God than to live the good life in the homes of the wicked." Korah tripped all over himself because being a gatekeeper in the house of the Lord was not enough. But his great whatever grandkids were able to say, you know what, whatever God wants me to do, even if it's holding the door open for people going into the temple, I'm good enough with that. So a couple of questions here today. Where is pride and arrogance filling your mind? Where's the area of your life where you're saying, I'm better than, or I deserve? Where's that happening in your life? And also, what is filling your heart with discontent, leading you to grumble and complain? Finally, this. Stay in your lane. One of my favorite passages of Scripture, in fact, I would love to preach this just every Sunday, is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. I'm going to read verse 1. "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us." Every single one of us has a lane that God has given us for life, a race. We don't get to run somebody else's race. Humbling ourselves before God means that we're going to run the course that's marked out for us. You join me in prayer.